Thanks very much, Simon. He's the Energizer Bunny of Australian politics, or the P.T. Barnum of Australian politics, but this is a young Conservatives function. That's why no one laughed at that joke. Look, it is fantastic to be here tonight. I really want to thank Liam and the team who are making conservatism cool again, which is fantastic, so that we don't just have old men like me talking about the debt. And I really want to pay tribute to Kate Horan, who couldn't be with us tonight, but did a lot of the work behind the scenes. Kate and Liam have asked me to talk a little bit about my own personal experience in terms of some of the battles over free speech, and then to try and propose a couple of solutions for Australia going forward. So 3 days before Christmas in 2016, I was on holidays with my family at the beautiful Gold Coast, and I received a call at about 9:30 at night from one of my staff. I was then managing director of the Australian Christian Lobby, a Canberra-based social policy lobby group. And the phone rang, and there'd been an incident at our office, our headquarters in Deakin in Canberra, just a few minutes' drive from Parliament House. And I soon learned, as I got onto the police, that someone had driven a van to the office, had parked in the car park right underneath my window. The van was laden with gas cylinders, and at least one of those gas cylinders had been ignited. There'd been a massive fireball. Windows on the ground floor were blown out. I mean, these were quite thick windows, about 4 or 5 of them just blown out. And one of the windows upstairs, in fact, where my PA sat, was blown out. $100,000 worth of damage was done to our building. The alleged perpetrator miraculously survived the blast, and despite massive burns to himself, managed to walk 4 kilometres to Canberra Hospital. While he was in a distressed state, he was interviewed very briefly by the police in a recorded interview, and then the doctors put him in an induced coma, and he was airlifted to Concord Hospital in Sydney. All of 2016, Australian Christian Lobby had been waging a very public campaign against some of the things that Miranda was talking about tonight, the idea of gender fluidity being taught in schools. We simply just believe that boys should be allowed to be boys and girls should be allowed to be girls. We're involved in the marriage debate. It was starting very much to get momentum throughout 2016. And there was a very agitated and committed group that were very angry with us for daring to speak in public and to engage this public policy debate. We were just simply using our free speech. The political arm of that very agitated and noisy small minority, the Greens, were regularly hopping up in Parliament throughout 2016 and calling me a bigot. Adam Bant called me a bigot in Parliament. Former Senator for South Australia, Rob Sims, called me a bigot on several occasions, even moved a motion to that effect. And they were saying that we were running this hateful campaign against people, which of course we weren't. This was all running through my mind as I caught the very earliest flight I could get in the early hours of the morning back to Canberra from Coolangatta. And my thoughts turned to this. I was also mindful that Senator Bernardi's office had been trashed by a bunch of violent thugs as well while Sinead was there and the other staff. And I got to Canberra Airport and I walked down the escalator, and there was this massive media pack there waiting for me. And just like for the politicians. And I thought for a moment, I feel like Cory Bernardi. But actually, I was actually feeling quite emotional and quite stressed at the whole situation. And I thought to myself, in fact, I said to the media at the bottom of the stairs, I said, this is not the Australia I grew up in. And then I was asked by the media, what do you think has motivated this? And obviously it was very early in the piece, and I gave a bit of a qualification, but I said, I really think this is an attack on free speech. Well, the Greens went nuts at that. Anyway, later that morning, I got to the office, and we were still picking through the rubble in the office, and the Australian Federal Police held a media conference, or the ACT Police held a media conference, and one of their spokesmen said to the Australian media, there is no political, religious or ideological motivation for this attack or for this incident. I was gobsmacked when I heard this. The Channel 7 reporter came back to the office and told me this, and I couldn't believe it. We were supposed to believe that some random guy who was obviously a bit mentally ill had just driven to our office, which was in a bit of a maze. It's quite a complex street layout to get to. It's dark, it's not very well lit, and you have to really know where you're going to get to our office. But we were told that this was just some random guy who wanted to somewhere randomly commit suicide, and it just happened to be at the ACL office. Well, 6 months later, when information was made available through the court process, we discovered that he actually did know exactly where he was going, and that in the interview that he'd given to the police, he said he didn't like the ACL, didn't like our political views, he thought religions were failed, and all of this sort of thing. And he knew on the night of the bombing where he was going. When the court finally released his name, I went back to the office and did a Google search and found out this guy was a fairly well-known same-sex marriage activist, had been involved in political campaigns in the US. And yet the AFP wanted us to believe, and they still maintain to this day, that there was no political, religious or ideological motivation. Now, needless to say, my confidence in the Australian Federal Police, this is a free speech forum, by the way, so I'm going to say some things which may not be popular in Canberra, but my confidence in the AFP is very much shaken, and that of my former staff. So what are the free speech lessons out of all of this? Well, I can tell you, and last week as a prime example, the Greens have learnt nothing. Last week, the Greens leader, Richard Di Natale, said that Donald Trump's rhetoric was linked to these pipe bomb attacks that were happening last week in America. These pipe bombs were sent in the mail to Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton and other leading Democrats, Robert De Niro. Fortunately, none of them went off. The bomb that went to our place did go off. But Di Natale's, he was asserting that Donald Trump's rhetoric emboldened fringe elements. And I was sitting in a coffee shop early last week reading this, and I couldn't believe it. And I texted Miranda Devine, just out of, I had to tell someone, this just didn't make sense at all. But the Greens, in the 12 months leading up to our bombing, had repeatedly been labelling me a bigot, using very inflammatory rhetoric, and labelling our campaigning as hate campaigning. Now, how is that not inciting behaviour that could lead to violence? By Di Natale's standards, it certainly is. And thanks, Miranda, for writing that up so eloquently in your column last week. It's a shame it's not carried in the Courier Mail. Now, I hated being called a bigot, and I hate being called a hater of gay people because I don't hate gay people. I do have disagreements with some of their political activists on issues of public policy. I have disagreements with heterosexual people on issues of public policy, but they never call me a hater. Maybe they're more tolerant, I don't know. Despite all this, I don't think the Greens' right to free speech should be restricted. They should be free to call me a bigot, even if it is not true, and even if I'm offended and hurt by this, which I was and am. But for free speech to work properly in a democracy, it requires the claims of those exercising free speech to be scrutinised and challenged publicly. If I was truly a bigot, why didn't the media investigate those claims and do one of two things? They could have proven the claim that I was bigoted and then driven me out of the public square. If the claims were true and could be proven, people would have stopped donating to the ACL and supporting the organisation. Instead, the organisation had 120,000 supporters and was in a very good state. But I guess the Greens would say, well, all of those 120,000 Australians are all bigots like you. I don't think so. The second thing the media could have done is disproven the claims that the Greens were making about our alleged bigotry. Then hopefully the Greens would have lost credibility and electoral support. Instead, the media often choose to let slurs against Conservatives go unchallenged. A democratic and free country doesn't just happen. It must be constantly nurtured, not neglected. Now, as Conservatives, we've been living our lives, running our businesses, doing our jobs, raising our families over these past 30 or so years, while others have been engaged in the democracy and have been spreading these sort of toxic ideas of identity politics, etc., that have really had quite a negative effect on our democracy and on freedom of speech. Democracy, by its definition, is participatory. If the various players in the democracy do not participate, then the democracy becomes dysfunctional. Australia right now, in my view, is a dysfunctional democracy. Whether it's the claims of climate alarmists or the purveyors of gender-bending programs in school, our media are not exercising basic curiosity, scepticism and investigation. Not enough of the public are demanding that they do their job properly. Apathy still rules in Australia. So they get away with this sloppiness. Now, Cameron Price from Channel 7 and Miranda Devine of the Daily Telegraph were the only journalists to put pressure on the Australian Federal Police about their claims of the ACL bombing. The left's approach to free speech is to control speech by legislation under the guise of protecting minorities, the sort of identity groups that Miranda just mentioned. So anti-discrimination law at state and federal level makes it illegal to offend, humiliate, or hold up to ridicule people because of their race, their gender, or their sexual identity. Now, that's broadly how the law stands at a federal and a state level. There are some variations at state level. All this sounds good in principle. No one wants to be racist, but suddenly, if you question certain practices in Islam, you're deemed a racist. Suddenly, people are silent when they know deep down in their hearts they should speak up. Miranda's already mentioned Douglas Murray's excellent book, The Strange Death of Europe. I'm about halfway through it at the moment. But he says in that book that fear of being labelled a racist caused even the UK police to overlook certain practices by Muslim men who were grooming children for sex. Now, there's court cases going on in the UK about this at the moment, but it's known that this sort of activity was going on for years and years, and the authorities turned a blind eye because of political correctness, because of fear of being labelled racist. If you oppose the redefinition of marriage, as 4.7 million Australians did in the plebiscite last year, you're a bigot and you're a homophobe. If you don't want your children to be taught that their gender is fluid at a safe school near you, you are transphobic. To be phobic means you have an irrational fear, and none of us want to be in that basket of deplorables. Sorry to be, Hillary Clinton's getting a good workout tonight. Most of us just want to be with the cool kids. And so people feel these pressures, and this becomes a real pressure on freedom of speech. There's the legal aspect through anti-discrimination law, and there's the pressure not to be a racist or a bigot or a homophobe or whatever it is that they're trying to shut down debate on. When the marriage law changed, suddenly anti-discrimination laws have been weaponised against those who have a different view on sexuality and gender. Religious schools right now are in a world of pain, along with the parents who don't hate gays. They just want their children to be educated in a community which upholds the ethos of their faith and morals. What's wrong with that? But sadly, what's been conflated with gay hate in this debate, which has become so toxic, it's become dominated by fake news. It really has, and I can understand Donald Trump's frustration and coining of that term. To say out loud one's views on marriage or gender now risks being dragged before an anti-discrimination tribunal. In this environment, people just self-censor their speech. Such is the chilling effect that the left are able to control speech and thought through labels and slurs backed up by anti-discrimination law. It's so easy to label someone, it's much harder to engage in an intellectual exercise with their ideas. It's the lazy way out, and the left have been getting away with it for far too long. I wonder if it was self-censorship bowing to the fear generated by not wanting to infringe on political correctness that stopped the Australian Federal Police from telling the Australian public the truth about the ACL bombing, that it was a gay activist who bombed our office. Now, Kate and Liam asked us to come up with solutions to the problems of free speech in this nation. And I haven't covered everything, obviously. I've just covered how it's affected me personally. But I've got 3 ideas which I think could potentially take our nation forward. I think the only restriction, and I haven't checked this with the party boss, so don't take this as Conservative Party policy tonight. The only restriction, I might get kicked out tonight, the only restriction I would place on free speech would be an incitement to violence. While none of us want to be offended, insulted or ridiculed on the basis of our race, gender or sexual identity, that is a bar that's far too low and far too subjective. Section 18C of the Federal Racial Discrimination Act and its many similar incarnations, which are embedded in the web of state-based anti-discrimination law, in my view, need to be repealed. Too much vexatious litigation has occurred because identity groups claim offence. Now, once you have a debate in public, someone's going to get offended. And that's how, in the rough and tumble, you work out the wise way forward for your society. But tonight we've got here my friend Bernard Gaynor, who's been the subject of repeated and vexatious litigation, which is really having a soul-destroying effect on him and his family, because some identity group is offended and they've dragged him through the courts over a period of many years now. And he's one of the real heroes in our nation. He's really the canary in the coal mine in this whole issue on free speech. All right, good on you, Bernard. The second solution, so repeal the provisions in anti-discrimination law about offence, insulting people. Look, I think if someone's being insulting in public, call it out in public. Don't take them to the anti-discrimination tribunal. You know, let's have the debate. Let's be mature adults. Let the water level find its right level through civil discourse, rather than taking someone to court just because you're offended by their idea. That doesn't make for good debate. The second solution is that we need to reform the media. Journalists must start applying, and Miranda's obviously exempt from this because she does this, but journalists must start applying the same standards of scrutiny across the political spectrum. You know, Cory will get a pretty rugged interview on most media outlets. Well, that's fine. You know, he's happy to put himself up for scrutiny. I am. But it's time the blowtorch was applied in equal measure to some of the wacky claims that come about gender and climate on the left of politics. We need a revival of curiosity, scepticism and investigation in our nation's media. Thirdly and lastly, we all need to participate in our democracy. It's great that we're here tonight to talk about free speech and political correctness going too far, but I think at the end of the day, it's not always just up to the government to fix every problem for ourselves. We still live in a democracy where we're free and where we can participate. This system of government was designed for participation by the citizens. It wasn't designed so that a group of elites could run things for us. I think because we've been conservative and getting on with our lives and thinking that Australia's a great place, the elites have taken over and they're running our government, they're running our public discourse as an oligarchy, and suddenly we're finding that, you know, basic values are being shut out of the public discourse and we can't even have a civil debate anymore. Well, we have to change that, and the best way we can change that while we still have the freedom is to participate. That's why I love the Conservative Party. It's bringing people back to participate in politics and it's emboldening them to speak up. The only forms of government where people don't participate are dictatorships. We need to break the dictatorship of the elites and their PC nonsense by getting involved. The best way to smash political correctness is to join the Conservative revolution. Thank you.